Eleanor Vance's last ticket was not a train ticket, but a letter. It was worn, its creases softened from being opened and read 100 times by the dim, flickering light of an oil lamp. Inside were the words of a stranger, a simple offer. In the wild Montana territory, a home in exchange for a partner. To others, it was a reckless gamble. To Eleanor, having lost everything, it was the only choice left. And as the stagecoach rolled into the town of Redemption, she clutched the letter, wondering if it was salvation or just another empty promise on a long, hard road. The stagecoach groaned to a halt, sighing a cloud of alkali dust into the late spring air of the Montana territory. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, a woman emerged not into the sunlight, but into a wall of silence from the town of Redemption. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and the set of her jaw suggested she'd long since stopped asking for permission to exist. The dress she wore, a calico print washed out to the pale color of a dawn sky, hung on a frame that had known better days. In her hand, she gripped the handle of a worn leather satchel, its seams holding on by little more than memory. Behind her, two small figures appeared, her son Thomas, who at 9 stood like a small sentinel, and little Clara, barely 5, whose hand was lost inside her mother's fist. They were a defiant trinity, a tiny, silent island in the dusty main street. On the porch of the saloon, conversations curdled into low murmurs. Men who had been leaning against the post straightened up, their gazes like small, sharp stones. They saw the whole story in a single glance, the widow, the Easterner, the two hungry mouths. They saw a burden and looked away. Eleanor heard the silence more than any word, and met it by lifting her chin a fraction higher. Inside the livery stable, the rhythmic ring of a hammer on an anvil suddenly ceased. Ben Coulter stood in the half-light, the scent of hot iron and horse sweat thick around him. He hadn't meant to watch, but the quiet that had fallen over the town was louder than his forge. Wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag, he stepped into the bright doorway and saw her. He saw the way she stood between her children and the town's hard stare. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but also a core of stillness, like a deep river that runs too powerful to show a ripple. It was a look he recognized, the look of someone who had been through the fire and hadn't burned. Without a second thought, he crossed the road, his worn boots kicking up small puffs of dust. The whispers on the porch died completely. "Ma'am?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Are you Mrs. Vance?" She turned, her eyes assessing him, searching for the judgment she'd seen everywhere else. "I am Ben Coulter," he said, gesturing with a nod back toward the livery. "I got your correspondence. A late snow kept me up in the crazies longer than I planned." A flicker of something weary irony, perhaps, passed over her face. "It would seem, Mr. Coulter, that the position has been filled by no one." He met her gaze, his own unwavering. "The offer stands." She stared at him, the silence stretching between them. He could see the pride warring with desperation in her eyes. "I have 2 children," she stated, as if it were a final, unbreakable fact. "I see that," he answered, his gaze softening as he glanced at the boy watching him with a man's gravity, and the little girl hiding behind her mother's skirt. "I have nothing," she added, her voice dropping but losing none of its edge. "What you see is all there is." Ben Coulter looked from the worn satchel to her resolute face, and then at the 2 small lives tethered to her. He saw not a burden, but a testament. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was as plain and solid as the mountains behind them. "What I see is backbone. This country has a use for that." He gave a slight, formal dip of his head. "They'll be fine. We'll all be fine." For the first time, the rigid line of Eleanor's shoulders seemed to soften, not in relief, but in acceptance. A quiet, unspoken contract had been sealed in the dust of redemption. The next dawn arrived not with a rooster's crow, but with the scent of lye soap and the scrape of a stiff brush against floorboards. Eleanor Vance was already at war with the dust and neglect of Ben Coulter's two-room cabin. She worked with a methodical fury, as if by imposing order on his home, she could impose it on her own life. Ben found her there when he came in from the corral, a pail of fresh, steaming milk in his hand. He stopped at the threshold, watching her on her hands and knees. He said nothing, simply set the pail on the table and left to chop firewood. He didn't offer thanks, and she didn't ask for it. The work was its own language. By the end of the week, a quiet rhythm had settled over the homestead. She mended the torn curtains with thread pulled from her own hem, and the windows, once clouded, now let in the clear Montana light. He, in turn, found his evenings ending earlier. He'd sit on the porch, sharpening a blade or mending a piece of tack, while she sat nearby shelling peas for the next day's meal. The silence between them was a shared space, filled not with words, but with the steady sound of two people working toward the same purpose. One evening, after the sun had bled its last color behind the pines and the children were asleep inside, Ben spoke into the twilight. "Nothing for you back in Missouri?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Eleanor didn't stop her hands from shelling the last of the pods. "Nothing but ghosts," she said, her voice flat. "My husband took his last breath in a silver mine. His family decided the shadow that followed him out there was me." She looked down at her hands. "They suggested I leave. So I did." The air grew still. Ben stared out at the dark line of the trees. "I lost my younger brother at Antietam," he said, the words costing him something. "When I came home, the silence in that house was louder than any cannon. Folks looked at me as if I'd come back by mistake." He paused. This was the only place big enough to hold that kind of quiet. A fragile truth now lay in the space between them. She looked at him then, truly looked at him. "Why did you answer my letter, Mr. Coulter? You wrote like a person who states facts." "Not wishes," he answered simply. She gave a short, mirthless exhale. "Be warned, I am not a gentle woman. There are burrs on me that can cut deep." Ben leaned his head back against the rough-hewn wall of the cabin. "This country's sharp all over, Mrs. Vance," he said. "I've learned how to handle it." Weeks turned into a month. One afternoon, the sky turned from a placid blue to a bruised purple with shocking speed. A storm rolled down from the mountains, the wind howling like a hungry wolf. Ben and Eleanor ran out toward the barn to secure the livestock. The big bay stallion, spooked by a crack of lightning, reared up, its eyes wild. Little Clara, who had followed her mother out, stood frozen in its path. Eleanor moved. It wasn't a thought. It was an instinct, a blur of calico and raw courage. She threw herself forward, shoving her daughter into the mud and taking the stallion's lancing kick square in the shoulder. She crumpled to the ground with a cry of pain, but her arms never loosened their hold on the child. Ben reached them in 3 long strides, his face pale with a terror he hadn't felt since the war. He lifted Eleanor from the mud as if she weighed nothing, his arms, used to the weight of anvils, impossibly gentle. Inside, he laid her on the cot and stripped away her soaked dress, his movements swift and sure. Her shoulder was already swelling, a dark bloom of purple against her pale skin. He sat beside her, his jaw tight with an emotion she couldn't name. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough. "She wouldn't have been," Eleanor whispered through gritted teeth, her gaze fixed on the door where Clara had been taken by Thomas. Ben reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "I have never seen strength like that in my life." Her eyes, bright with unshed tears of pain and exhaustion, met his. "You're the only one," she breathed, "who ever looked at me and saw strength instead of trouble." He lifted her hand, pressing her knuckles to his lips, then to his chest, holding it there over the steady beat of his heart. In the dim light of the cabin, with the storm still raging outside, he leaned down. Their foreheads touched first, a silent acknowledgement. Then, his lips found hers. It wasn't a kiss of passion or of pity. It was a kiss of recognition, quiet and sure and right. Outside, the storm broke. Inside, the foundation of a new life settled firmly into place. The high grass of the pasture began to cure in the summer sun, turning from green to a pale, shimmering gold. A comfortable quiet had settled into the corners of the cabin, a quiet born not of emptiness, but of contentment. It was broken one evening by the news of Ben's departure. "Word came from the Miller place," he said, setting his hat on its peg by the door. His eyes carried the reluctance he wouldn't voice. "Their herd broke fence up near the mussel shoal. They need riders." Eleanor stilled her hands over the basin of water where she was washing vegetables. "How long?" "4 days. Maybe 5. He looked at her, at the children playing on the floor. "It's a lot of country to be alone in." She simply met his gaze, her look steady as stone. "The work will get done, Ben." He nodded, knowing it was true. Later, as he prepared to leave, he paused by the door. "The Winchester is loaded." "It always is," she replied without looking up. It was all the reassurance he needed. The days that followed were marked by the familiar rhythm of chores. Eleanor and Thomas managed the small herd, checked the water troughs, and walked the fence lines. The routine was a comfort, a bulwark against the vast emptiness of the plains. On the 3rd night, as the wind soughed through the pines, a sound broke the stillness. It was not the frantic rap of an emergency, nor the confident knock of a neighbor. It was hesitant. 3 soft thuds against the wood. Eleanor reached for the rifle, leaning against the wall, her movements silent. She motioned for Thomas to stay with his sister. Opening the door a crack, she saw a figure more shadow than boy, shivering in the cool night air. His lip was split, and the ghost of a black eye was forming. "Ain't here for trouble, ma'am," he stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "Just water, please." She studied him for a long moment. He couldn't have been more than 15. This was not a threat. This was a victim. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." Inside, she gave him a dipper of water, which he drank like a man dying of thirst. She soaked a rag in warm water and handed it to him for his face. She didn't press him for his story, but he offered it up in broken pieces. A drunken uncle. A heavy hand, running away. His name was Leo. "You can sleep in the barn," she said, handing him a thick slice of bread. "There are blankets in the loft." He stared at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language, the language of mercy. That night, Eleanor sat in a chair by the hearth, the rifle across her lap. She listened to the breathing of her children and the lonely howl of the wind, and she listened for any sound from the barn. She trusted her judgment about the boy, but a woman alone could not afford to trust anything completely. Leo stayed for 2 days. He chopped wood and cleared stones from her small garden without being asked, working with a desperate, silent energy. Eleanor watched him, and in his haunted eyes, she saw the echo of every person who ever had to run from something. On the 2nd night, she saw him staring west, toward the unending horizon. She knew he wouldn't stay. Before dawn on the 3rd day, she placed a pair of Ben's old sturdy boots by the barn door. They were well worn, but had miles left in them. When the sun rose, the boy was gone. The boots were gone with him. Ben returned that evening, slumping in the saddle, his face caked with dust and hollowed by exhaustion. Eleanor stepped onto the porch as he dismounted. He said nothing, just walked toward her, and she reached for his hand before he could reach for her. He held it like a man grabbing a lifeline. Later, after a quiet supper, he watched as Thomas read a book to his little sister by the firelight. "You've given that boy a quiet center," Ben said, his voice low. "He learns from watching you." "He learns from you too," she replied softly. They sat in the growing dark, the weariness of his journey hanging between them. "Every night," he said, turning to her, "I'd look west and picture the light in this window. "You're a man who finishes what he starts," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of faith. He reached out, his thumb brushing her cheek. "I don't aim to spend another night away from this place," he said, his voice thick with a promise. That went deeper than words. "Not if I can help it." July burned across the plains, the heat settling in the valley like a thick woolen blanket. The air was heavy with the drone of flies, and the world seemed to move at a slower, more deliberate pace. It was in this oppressive stillness that Ben and Thomas rode out to check a section of the creek where cougar tracks had been spotted days before. The first sign of trouble was a lone rider, pushing his horse harder than any man would in such heat. He slid to a halt in the yard, the animals' flanks heaving. "It's the boy," the man gasped, his eyes wild with urgency. "The horse spooked. He's hurt bad. Ben sent me." There was no moment of shock in Eleanor. There was only a cold clarity. Her hands were already moving, grabbing the canvas roll she kept by the hearth, a kit filled with clean linen, salves, and carbolic acid. She saddled the mare with an economy of motion that wasted nothing, swinging Clara up in front of her before mounting herself. She followed the rider at a gallop, the pounding of hooves a frantic prayer against the baked earth. They found them in a line rider's derelict cabin, half swallowed by sagebrush on a lonely ridge. Ben was kneeling on the floor beside Thomas, his big, capable hands clenched into useless fists. The boy lay on a cot, his face the color of bleached linen, his leg bent at an angle that defied nature. "The cat came out of the brush," Ben said, his voice a raw whisper of self-recrimination. "I couldn't get to him in time." Eleanor didn't answer. She dropped to her knees beside her son, and the world narrowed to that small space. Her hands, steady and sure, moved with a surgeon's purpose. She cut away the denim pant leg with a small knife from her kit. She examined the break, her touch firm but gentle. Then, using 2 slats of wood from a broken crate and strips of linen, she began the slow, painful work of setting the bone and binding the splint. She spoke to Thomas throughout, her voice a low, calming murmur that never wavered. When it was done, she wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "He'll keep the leg," she said, the words cutting through the tension in the room. "But he won't be walking on it for a long while." Ben hadn't moved. The guilt was a physical weight on his shoulders. Eleanor reached out and laid her hand on his cheek, her touch not one of soft pity, but of steady, solid reassurance. "He's alive, Ben. You got him here. That's the only thing that counts." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man. Finding shelter in a storm, that night they stayed in the cabin. Ben built a small fire while Eleanor made Thomas as comfortable as possible. Clara slept curled beside her brother. Later, Eleanor stood by the cabin's single crooked window, watching the moon rise over the dark plains. Ben came to stand beside her. He didn't cry out, Ben said into the quiet. Not once. Held the reins till the very end. "He has your grit," she replied softly. She drew a breath. "He's your son now, you know. In all the ways that matter. I've known that for some time." Ben answered. He turned to face her in the moonlight. "Eleanor ... It seems to me we've been living this marriage for months. It's time we made it plain." She didn't feign surprise. There were no more veils between them. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure, "it's time." 2 weeks later, the circuit preacher came out from Lewistown. Eleanor wore a simple dress with her mother's silver brooch pinned at the collar, the only fine thing she owned. Ben stood beside her in a clean shirt, his hair trimmed. Thomas leaned on a rough-hewn crutch, while Clara clutched a fistful of prairie daisies. Beneath the shade of a lone cottonwood tree behind the barn, they spoke plain words for a plain truth, vows that were not promises for the future, but an acknowledgement of a reality already forged. After the preacher had left, Eleanor stood watching the sky turn pink at the edges. Ben came up behind her and rested a hand on her waist. penny for your thoughts," he said gently. She leaned back against him. "I was just realizing," she said, a slow wonder in her voice. "This is the first day I can remember where I haven't been bracing for the next bad thing to happen." He tightened his arm around her, a solid, unwavering presence. "My promise to you, Eleanor," he vowed, "is that you'll never have to brace for it alone again." Autumn arrived with a sharp, clean edge to the air, and the sunlight slanted low across the fields, casting long shadows. The cottonwood leaves turned a brittle, fiery gold. It was during this season of change that a shadow from Eleanor's past found its way to Montana. Ben was riding back from town when Sheriff Rowan reined in beside him. "Ben," the sheriff said, his face drawn, "there's a man in town, asking questions about your wife." He paused, letting his horse shift. "Says he's kin, a Mr. Arthur Hayes from back east." When Ben told her, Eleanor didn't flinch. A familiar coldness settled deep within her. She wiped her hands slowly on her apron, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "He is my late husband's cousin," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Arthur never comes visiting. He only comes to collect. He arrived 2 evenings later, just as dusk was settling. He rode a fine horse and wore a city coat and polished boots that seemed to rebuke the dusty ground they stood upon. He dismounted with a proprietary air, approaching the porch as if he owned it. "Eleanor," he said, forgoing any formal greeting, "you've made yourself quite scarce." "Not scarce enough, it seems," she replied, her voice as crisp as the autumn air. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "A curious arrangement you have here, marrying the man who took you in." He removed his leather gloves with deliberate care. "Your husband, God rest him, left behind some considerable debts. I'm here on behalf of the family to see them settled." "There's nothing here that was his," she said plainly. "Perhaps not," Arthur conceded. "The children, however, are a matter of blood. They are Vance blood. They belong with their family." From the deep shadows near the barn, man emerged. He moved without a sound, a formidable presence against the fading light. He stopped beside Eleanor, a silent wall. "They're home," Ben said, his voice low and final. Arthur's polished composure twitched. "And you think you can stop me?" It was Eleanor who answered, stepping forward slightly. "Blood?" she asked, her voice laced with a cold fire Arthur had never heard before. "You speak of blood? Where was that blood, Arthur, when their father was put in the ground? Where was it in the long winter that followed? You never wrote. You never sent. A penny. You abandoned them as surely as if you had left them on a mountainside. You have no claim here. You are 5 winters too late." Rage flickered in Arthur's eyes. He turned to leave, his boots grinding in the dirt. "This is not over," he spat. "The law may see things differently." They watched him ride away until he was just a speck in the vast twilight. "He'll be back," Ben said. "We'll be ready," Eleanor replied. That night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor took a small, tied bundle of letters from the bottom of her satchel. They were the last remnants of her previous life. One by one, without rereading them, she fed them into the firebox of the stove. She watched until every word, every memory, had curled into black ash. Later, she sat on the edge of their bed, watching Ben move about the quiet room. "Did you ever imagine it would come to this?" she asked softly, "fighting for them against the ghosts of my own past?" He came and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "Eleanor," he said, his voice imbued with a deep, quiet truth, "I never imagined I'd have a this to fight for." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Sheriff Rowan. The county judge in Lewistown had reviewed Arthur Hayes's petition. The ruling was unceremonious and final, a claim based on blood relation alone. After years of demonstrable abandonment, had no legal footing. The matter was closed. Eleanor read the letter was, folded it neatly, and placed it in a small tin box with the spare buttons and stray needles. It needed no further ceremony. That Sunday, they rode into town as a family. At the small white chapel, they took a pew near a window that let in the thin autumn light. During the final hymn, Ben reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. She didn't look at him, just held on. They didn't need to speak. Everything that mattered was already there, safe within the walls of their home, secure. Within the circle of their hands. Nothing could take it from them now. The first snows came before the last of the autumn leaves had fallen, dusting the golden grass with a layer of white. One morning, Eleanor stood at the cabin window, watching the flakes drift past the smokehouse in a slow, hypnotic dance. She didn't speak, just rested one hand low on her stomach, where a new life was quietly taking root. Ben came in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots, and saw her there. He saw the gentle curve of her hand and the distant look in her eyes. He crossed the room, his footsteps soft on the floorboards he now knew so well. "Eleanor?" He asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet holding the weight of the question. She turned from the window and gave a slow, certain nod. 2 months now, she said. She met his gaze, her own betraying a flicker of vulnerability. "It frightens me, Ben." He took her hand, his palm warm and steady against hers. "Then we'll be frightened together," he answered. Winter settled in, deep and binding. They hung extra quilts over the windows and kept the stove fed day and night. In the long, dark evenings, Ben sat by the fire, sanding a cradle he had fashioned from a piece of fine-grained pine, its rockers curving with a craftsman's care. Thomas, his leg now healed and strong, spent hours sketching plans for a new chicken coop he meant to build come spring. A sense of quiet anticipation filled the small cabin, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The baby chose to arrive on a bitter morning in the heart of that winter, before the sun had even thought to rise. Eleanor woke to a sharp, insistent pain. She breathed through it, slow and steady, until she could no longer keep it to herself. When she finally woke Ben, her voice was tight but calm. "It's time." He moved without panic, a man who understood crisis. He set a kettle on the stove, laid out clean linens, and then gently roused Thomas. "Son," he said quietly, "I need you to ride over to the Gable place. Fetch Mrs. Gable." The boy nodded, his face serious, and was gone into the pre-dawn darkness. Ben then lifted a sleepy Clara into his arms, whispering something that made her nod and press a kiss to her mother's hand before he took her into the main room. Mrs. Gable arrived with the first gray light, a stout, no-nonsense woman who had seen more life come into the world than most. Hours passed. Snow piled in silent drifts against the windows. Ben waited outside the bedroom door, his pacing a slow, worn path in the floorboards. Then, just as the light began to fade once more, a new sound split the muffled silence of the snowbound world, a cry not of pain, but of pure, unbridled life. Mrs. Gable emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "You have a daughter, Mr. Coulter." Ben walked past her into the room. Eleanor lay back against the pillows, pale with exhaustion but luminous. Nestled in the crook of her arm was a small bundled miracle. She looked up as he approached, and for the first time, he saw a smile on her face that held no shadow of the past, no hint of sorrow. It was pure light. "She's a fighter," Eleanor whispered. He reached down, one hand resting on her shoulder, the other gently touching the baby's downy head. "She comes by it honestly," he said, his voice thick. They named her Ann. By spring, the land had softened. The creek swelled with meltwater, and the first green shoots pushed their way through the damp earth like promises kept. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat on the porch steps rocking Ann, Ben came out of the barn carrying a small tin box. He sat beside her and opened it. Inside, folded neatly, was a deed. "Bought the North Quarter section," he said, his thumb brushing the edge of the paper. "The land that runs along the creek, good grazing. Figured we could use the room. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. She looked from the paper to his face, her eyes soft. You always were a man who knew how to build things, Ben Coulter. Only ever wanted to build it with you, he replied. He knelt beside her, resting one hand on the baby's back and the other over hers. You're my whole life, Eleanor, you and these children. She leaned her forehead against his. And you are mine. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, they lay together in the quiet dark. Anne slept peacefully between them, her tiny breaths a steady rhythm in the room. The window was cracked just enough to let in the scent of pine and thawed soil. Ben? She whispered. Do you ever wonder? What if that blizzard hadn't kept you in the mountains that spring? He turned to her in the darkness, and she could feel the absolute certainty in him. No, he said, I don't. Because whatever that other life was ... it wasn't this one. She smiled, a secret smile in the dark, and her hand found his under the quilt. This is more, she said, than I ever knew how to hope for. Then, he answered, his fingers lacing through hers, we'll just keep living it, day by day. And they did. The house never felt empty again, and the land which had once seemed so vast and unforgiving was simply home.